indicating that it's being recorded. So again, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this OASIS class, Advanced Directives Demystified. I'm Janice Pleiner. I'm the program manager at OASIS, and today I'll be your Zoom moderator, helping to make this class run as smoothly as possible. Thank you for keeping your audio muted during the presentation. You will have an opportunity to ask questions. I'll talk about that in just a moment. We're very appreciative to AARP Maryland for sponsoring today's class. Their support has enabled us to promote this program far and wide. And I'd like to welcome all of those who may be joining OASIS for the first time with this class. I know you'll find the program informative and engaging, and I hope that you'll join us for future classes. Captions have been enabled for today's class. You can turn the captions on or off on your own device. And we will take questions. We'll pause. The speaker will pause occasionally and ask for questions, and you can always be putting questions into the chat, which I'll monitor. And we'll do questions throughout the presentation at various points and also at the end. And hopefully we'll have an opportunity for everyone to get their questions answered. Thank you again, all participants, for muting yourselves. Again, you can put a question in the chat. If you have a question you'd like to ask out loud at the end of the presentation, you can use the raise hand feature in Zoom and I'll recognize you. So our speaker today is Dr. Eleanor Tano. Dr. Tano is a board-certified family physician in Rockville, Maryland, where she practices primary care. Dr. Tano is passionate about all people having an advanced directive and is the founder of Advanced Directive MD. To this end, she educates her clients about creating a meaningful, specific advanced directive to eventually guide their families in honoring their end-of-life wishes. Dr. Tano has an undergraduate degree in biomedical engineering and a medical doctorate, along with specialty training in family medicine. To kick off today's session, I'd like to invite Ted Meyerson from AARP Maryland, who has been very involved on many committees and programs throughout the state of Maryland on this topic of advanced directive. He'll share some brief remarks, and then Ted will hand things off to Dr. Tano. Please go ahead, Ted.
Good afternoon. I am a volunteer with AARP Maryland. I'm sure most of you are familiar with AARP. AARP advocates for policies that matter most to seniors age 50 and older. AARP is about 40 million members nationally and about 850,000 members in Maryland. Legislators listen to what AARP has to say. Currently, AARP National is fighting to ensure that Social Security and Medicare maintain their benefits. As we speak, AARP Maryland staff and volunteers are in Annapolis advocating for legislation that will benefit Maryland seniors. Some issues on the AARP Maryland agenda involve supporting family caregivers, achieving affordable, reliable utilities, protecting seniors from fraud and scams, and building new tools to help working Marylanders save for retirement. I'm sure everyone knows about the discounts available through AARP. Additionally, AARP puts on events for its members that range from movies for grown-ups to low-impact Zumba, to shredding events, safe driving courses, and so much more. You can see a full list of the events if you just Google AARP Maryland, get on their webpage, and the whole list is there. AARP is happy to sponsor this class on demystifying advanced directives. You know, we use advanced instructions all the time. We leave a note instructing our kids to do something when he or she gets home from school. You're going to a Zoom presentation in 2 weeks and you send out instructions about how to log on. You tell your brother where you'll be and ask him to call when he gets back from a trip. An advanced directive is no more than advanced instructions that allow somebody to maintain control over their health care, even if they become so ill they can't speak for themselves. Creating an advanced directive is simple and doesn't have to cost anything. Here are some steps you can take to create an advanced directive, and it can be really simple. Choose someone who will represent you and make sure he or she agrees to be your agent and understands the kind of medical treatment you would want or not want. That person is called your healthcare agent. Name an alternative in case the first person isn't available when needed. Grab a pen or even an envelope would do. Write down the names of the healthcare agents. Write down how you want to be treated. Do everything to keep me alive. But if there's no brain function, unplug everything and let me pass peacefully. Don't let Uncle John anywhere near me. He'll start crying and upset me. I want quiet music playing. Anything you want to write down is fair. Take the pad next door, sign and date what you've written, get your neighbor and his wife to date and sign it, and you have a legal advanced directive. It's that simple. Write it down, get 2 witnesses. That's it. There are some simple rules on the Maryland Attorney General's webpage about who can be an agent and who can be a witness, but it's really a simple thing to do. If you want something more sophisticated than on the back of an envelope, you can use any number of templates that you can find online. A very popular one is called 5 Wishes, and I think there'll be a link given to you when this is over where you can get the 5 wishes. I use the one that's on the Maryland Healthcare Decisions Act, which is on the Maryland Attorney General's webpage, and I think you're going to get a link for that too. And you don't need a lawyer, but you surely might want to discuss medical choices with your doctor to make sure your choices are medically sound. Another option is to create an AD online at mydirectives.com. You don't even need witnesses. If you have a written AD, you can upload it to MyDirectives. It's all free. Since MyDirectives is linked to the statewide medical record system called CRISP, your advanced directive will be available to any hospital or doc that has access to the system. An advanced directive remains in effect until you change it or withdraw it. After I made my advanced directive, I got my family together and told them about it. Copies are legal, so I made copies for every member of the family, for my doc and my lawyer and anybody else. I have copies on my file cabinet. I have copies on my desktop, on my cell phone. Advanced directives are not secrets. You want providers to know what to do. If your advanced directive is not available, it may as well not exist. You should review your advanced directive every year to be sure it still reflects your wishes. If you change something, make sure to redistribute copies to everyone. Advanced directives let everyone understand the kind of choices you wish to be made for you, and they will make them for you because you've written them down. Knowing your wishes gives assurances to everyone and prevents squabbling about who really knows what you want. That's a win for the family. But the real winner is you. You will have kept control of your health care and gotten the treatments you wanted without getting treatments you did not want. If you're 18 years or older, do yourself a favor, create an advance directive. And Dr. Tano will now tell us in more detail what an advance directive is and what you ought to do about it.
Thank you, Ted. Great information packed into that introduction. So I can just go home now and enjoy the rest of my afternoon outside, I think. I hope we don't lose too many people to the nice weather. So as Ted so kindly introduced me, and Janice as well, I am Eleanor Tano. I am a practicing family medicine physician in Rockville, Maryland. I do primary care of adults mostly. And I'm passionate about advanced directives. And so the question people always ask me is, why? So why advanced directives? Why am I interested in this? Where does this come from? And really, it comes from my experience of being in the hospital, being in the intensive care unit, being with very sick patients who are not able to communicate their medical wishes. And as the doctor, turning to the family and saying, what is your mother, your father, what kind of care would she have wanted? And most times people look at each other and they say, like, I don't really know, we didn't talk about it. And that leads them with a lot of questions and guilt moving forward in where, in what to do. And then the other situation that I often saw was, so one was people often didn't talk about it at all. Two was that they did talk about it in the form of an advance directive that they had made with an estate attorney that was often 10, maybe even 20 years old. And it was just very boilerplate. It didn't add a lot of details and no one had really talked about it. So you're just reading off a form and trying to interpret that in the context of the medical situation. So that, that's what interested me in it. And I thought to myself, we should really talk about these more, and we should talk about them with each other, and we should talk about them with physicians, because just a legal document, it just, it's black and white. It doesn't add a lot of color. Sorry, there's a little question in the chat. Weather might be nice. All right. So if you guys could post questions in the chat as you go, I'll try to answer them. I'll also leave time at the end for questions. So what I decided to do here is to discuss advanced directives, teach about them in a more interactive story, because I think if we can add a real live example and a personal touch to this seemingly dry topic, I think it helps people really think about advanced directives in the context when they're used. I'm going to do a story as we go, and please follow along, and I'm going to be teaching throughout as well. So this is an experience that I had when I was in the hospital. So I'm standing in the ICU, the intensive care unit of the hospital, and it's cold. I mean, in the hospital, you always feel a little chill. The air is sort of this crisp air. It smells like bleach, plastic use products. I have scrubs. They're low around my waist. There's sort of this drawstring that's always threatening just to fall off. And you have this scrub top that never really quite fits. And I'm standing in the hospital room of this intensive care unit, and it's crowded with medical equipment. So the way, if you've been in a hospital room, you can imagine a normal bed if you've ever visited someone there or been in a hospital. But in the intensive care unit, you have a way more in the way of machines in the room. You have ventilators, pumps, there's all kinds of things. And so this room that normally isn't very big, especially feels small. And there's all kinds of things beeping, little lights flashing, squiggly lines moving across screens. And in the middle of this intensive care unit room is my patient. She's an older woman. She's in her 90s. She's in the hospital bed. She has end-stage dementia, and she's been admitted for severe dehydration after she completely stopped eating about a week ago. So she's connected to a ventilator. She has a number of IVs inserted into her, and her eyes are closed, and she's sedated medically so that she doesn't wake up and pull out all this equipment. And her daughter, Rachel, is by her bedside. She's a woman in her late 50s, and she looks exhausted. She's kind of curled up in a ball in one of these uncomfortable hospital chairs. She's wearing an oversized sweatshirt, yoga pants, sneakers, And you can tell that she is normally really well put together. And I have just caught her on one of the worst days of her life. So what you need to know here is that Rachel is her mom's primary caregiver. And if any of you have ever been in a caregiving role or know anyone who's been in a caregiving role, this is a full-time job and it's really hard. So she's doing her best, but her mom's dementia has progressed, over the years, and over the last couple of months, it's gotten pretty bad. And in that time, the last 6 months or so, her mom hasn't really been able to recognize her. She's not been able to take care of her basic needs, getting herself dressed, going to the bathroom without some assistance. And then in recent weeks, she really just stopped eating, anything significant. And a week ago, she stopped altogether. And, Rachel has done everything. She's been an excellent caregiver this whole time. Everything that a loving caregiver and daughter would do. She takes her mom to appointments. She takes her mom to medical appointments, hair appointments. She gets her dressed. She handles all her finances. There's so much work in taking over somebody's life in this way. And her mom has been telling her that she's ready to go for almost as long as Rachel has been her caregiver. The patient's husband died about 5 years ago. And since then, she's just been on a slow decline. And Rachel knows that her mom is ready to die. And the last couple of weeks when she hasn't been eating, she knew, the writing was on the wall that the end was near. So as Rachel sits in this ICU bed looking at her mom, her phone rings, and it's her sister, Michelle, who says, I just got off the plane. She's come in town from California where she lives. So Michelle shows up at the hospital, and she looks freshly tan from California. She has this energy of somebody who just got off a flight. And it's a stark difference to Rachel, who looks just exhausted. But for Michelle, the last time she saw her mom was about 6 months ago, when things were better in the world of her mom's dementia. Her mom was more herself. She was better able to take care of her basic needs. She knew who the daughters were. And she was, smiled at them and made some kind of engaging eye contact. But this woman that Michelle runs into in the hospital has parched lips, matted hair. She's just this waif of somebody she used to know. The mother she knows always had on lipstick and a pressed shirt and her hair done. And this is just really a stark change. And she looks horrified and she looks terrified. Next to her, Rachel's more calm but tired. And Rachel fills Michelle in on the situation. And she says to Michelle, it's time to let her go. And Michelle, seemingly surprised by this information, says, do you mean let her die? And so this is where I come in the room, right? Because remember, I'm the physician. I'm just sort of watching this scene. And I sit with them and I say, your mom is really sick. She has end-stage dementia. She stopped eating. She's extremely dehydrated. Medically, because she's so dehydrated, her electrolytes are imbalanced. This is leading to cardiac problems, heart problems. And with all the modern medicine, we might be able to delay her death a few days or a few weeks. We can rehydrate her, we can do these things, but likely she'll come back to a much reduced state of where she even was to begin with, which wasn't very much. So I offer the full spectrum of medical care, from the least invasive, let's focus on comfort, and then to the most invasive, using all the machines that we can do to sustain life in the ICU. So this would be things like the ventilators, the medications to bring up blood pressure called pressors, a feeding tube, obviously IVs with fluids. And her daughter, Rachel, her caregiver, just can't imagine that even if we do these things, that if her mom comes back to less than she was before, that she just can't imagine that life. And then, in contrast to that, Michelle looks at me and then at Rachel and says, we're going to do everything, right? So this is, let me just see, there's a chat question here. Yeah, I'll have to come back maybe and look at these questions later. I don't know if I can.
Yeah, Eleanor.
Yeah.
You don't worry about the questions for right now.
Okay.
When you want to pause and take some, I can summarize for you, and I'll make sure that we get people's questions addressed.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Okay. So what we have here are Rachel and Michelle, who are on different pages, clearly. And this is where I want to stop and talk about medical powers of attorney. So usually I would try to ask you guys a little bit more interactively about what we know, but I think we have too big of a group to do that in any kind of meaningful way. So a medical power of attorney. So this is somebody who you choose to make medical decisions on your behalf. And this only comes into effect if you're not able to make your own decisions. As long as you are medically able, talking, making sense, coherent, doctors will always ask you about what you want. So the medical power of attorney is irrelevant as long as you're conscious and, not delirious, basically. And so this is somebody you choose. It can be, as Ted said in the beginning, pretty much anyone. There's a couple restrictions, but for the most part, any adult over 18. Typically, people will have their spouse be their medical decision, or their adult children if their spouse is passed away, or if they're divorced. And then if it's unknown, which is the vast majority of cases of people who don't have an advance directive and don't have a designated power of attorney, the default is a spouse, even if that person is estranged from you, just know that. And then it goes to adult children equally. So this is another place where people sometimes can get a little tripped up, is that if you have many children, there can be, as Ted used the word squabbling, which I think I'm going to commit to memory. I love that. So if there's multiple children, there can be a disagreement if people aren't on the same page. Or sometimes people have children who are, for some reason, not emotionally mature enough to make these decisions. Perhaps they're abroad on a military assignment and just really not available. Maybe they have severe mental health issues. Maybe they have one child who's a doctor and one who's, an accountant, and it just makes more sense to specifically designate somebody. But my point is, if you don't specifically have the power of attorney legally designated, the default is that they are equally able to make decisions for you. And then it goes to family members from there, more distant, and it can get a little bit murky there. If there's no apparent choice, the court will appoint a guardian for you. So this is like a social worker assigned to your case. This is obviously not an ideal situation. And about 1 in 5 people do not have an apparent, spouse or child or somebody who they would ask. So if you're in that 20% of people, which is not a small percentage, don't feel like you're alone. You can ask anyone to be your medical power of attorney. It can be your best friend. It can be your nephew. It can be anyone. You just would have to put that in writing and make it very clear that that is who you want to make your decisions for you. So back to Rachel and Michelle. So my patient here, she's, as I mentioned, her husband had died a few years ago. She's a widow, and her adult children have equal say in her end of life care, unless there's a documented power of attorney that says either one or the other, or something altogether that's different. So I asked how they would like to proceed, and it's very clear that they're not on the same page, right? Rachel, her caregiver, has been living with her 6 months, has seen this decline, and knows that her quality of life was pretty bad. Michelle hasn't seen her in a couple of months and is remembering the mom of months past who was in a much better state and is imagining we would bring her back to that person. So I asked, did you guys ever have these conversations? And Rachel says, kind of. She said things like, I'm ready to go. And Michelle says no. And this is not an uncommon situation where a parent has maybe talked to one child, but not the other, or maybe one child was ready to hear it and the other one wasn't. And so then I say, well, did she have an advance directive? So what is an advance directive? I think a lot of people get overwhelmed by this idea. So an advance directive is a set of instructions, and you can put it in the form of a legal document that you create to guide a designated person, so that's your medical power of attorney, in the kind of medical care that you would want if you're not able to speak for yourself. So what I think is, when you look at this statement, this is a lot of you. These are directions you make that you give to somebody you choose about the care you want, only when you're not able to speak for yourself. So that's the basic. So an advance directive is really, in its simplicity, I mean, if you boil it down, there's just 2 parts. One is naming your medical power of attorney, which we just went over. And at the end, I'll go through some resources. On my website, I have an article that's pitfalls of choosing your medical power of attorney. So some common situations people may have not anticipated that end up being actually a little bit of a problem later. So one is naming your medical power of attorney. That's it. That's part one of every advance directive. Whether you use the Maryland State Advance Directive form, or you make it with a attorney, or you make your advance directive with the My 5 Wishes document, or whatever document you use, part one is always naming who this person is and then a backup agent in case they're not available. And then part two is naming your medical wishes. And sometimes people refer to this part as the living will. So a lot of times when I say advance directive, people look at me like, I don't know what that is. And I say living will and they know, but really the living will is just the medical part of the advance directive. So that's what an advance directive is in its essence. And so I asked Michelle and Rachel, does your mom have an advance directive? And Rachel says, I think so. Let me go, give me an evening to go see if I can find it. And so what we agree to do is ICU level care overnight. So her mom's going to stay on the ventilator with all the tubes attached, and then we'll reconvene in the morning so that they can discuss. Luckily, in this case, their mom is pretty stable. And so we have the luxury of a day or two to kind of figure this out. Sometimes these decisions, you just don't have this kind of time, which is usually when somebody's sicker anyway. And so to be honest, it doesn't even make a difference because they're probably pretty sick. And so there's not much medical care that's going to change that. So the next morning, Rachel comes with a copy of her mother's advance directive, and it says the typical boilerplate wording from the estate planning, the document that she made with an attorney many years ago. And I will read, this is exactly what is on the Maryland Advance Directive. It says, if my doctors certify that my death from a terminal condition is imminent, even if life-sustaining procedures are used, keep me comfortable, allow a natural death to occur. I do not want any medical interventions used to extend my life. I do not want to receive nutrition and fluids by tube or other medical means. And this sounds, I think when you're filling out this form, this sounds pretty informative. This is somebody who doesn't want aggressive medical care. But the problem is the wording of terminal, my death from a terminal medical condition is imminent. And so when I try to apply that to my patient in the ICU, the question is, does she have a terminal medical condition? She has dementia. She has dehydrated. If we removed all the tubes, she would pass away. If we continue the tubes, she might go back to where she kind of was. And that's the problem in medicine, is that we could always do something more. There's always something you can do. And in this case, we could give her IV fluids. We could put a feeding tube in and see if that, brings her back to a state of a little bit more hydration and perks her up enough to get off the ventilator. So we could all do all those things, but the real question is, should we? So I look at Rachel and Michelle, knowing that the document helps a little. This isn't somebody who wants to do a million invasive things at the end of life, but it doesn't really fully clarify, the situation that we're dealing with. And this is part two of the medical wishes. This is where these conversations are so important, and having quality people, like conversations with the people in their life who are going to be making these decisions, actually becomes the issue at hand. So when it comes to medical wishes with my patient, I ask them, what was important to your mom? What did she wake up for in the morning? And the two girls kind of look at each other, and Michelle says, she loved to garden. She loved to go to the grocery store. She loved to go and get food so that she could make an elaborate dinner. And she couldn't drive, but somebody could take her. And after a dinner, she would take a walk. And Rachel, who's been with her, says she probably hasn't been able to do those things for a year. Her dementia was more severe, and in the past few weeks, she wasn't even eating. So then I asked the question, in the past few weeks, what did your mom wake up for? And Rachel says, nothing. She sort of slept most of the day. And this is where I just want to pause and say, we're in an ICU, an intensive care unit. We have machines and tubes and drugs that can keep people alive. But when people reach the end of their recognizable lives, we have to ask the apparent question, which is, when do we stop this aggressive medical care? And are we there yet? Because that's where this gray part is, right? You can have this advanced directive that says, if I'm in a persistent vegetative state, remove all the, pull the plug, as people will say. But really, there's so many nuances. It makes it hard to really know what that means in this moment. And so just to tell you guys a little about the medical part of what can happen in an intensive care unit is we have ventilators. This supports your lungs. We have dialysis. It supports your kidneys. We have antibiotics. During COVID, we had all the monoclonal antibodies that could help with infection. We have feeding tubes and IV tubes that can help support the stomach and provide nutrition. And then we have medications that can bring up people's blood pressure if it gets dangerously low. So these are people who are in a very sick state whose blood pressure is say 50, 50 over 30 or something. And so there's drugs that can help bring that up so that you maintain perfusion to the rest of the body. And so the question in the ICU becomes, because we have all of these amazing tools, where do you stop? Like, where is the end of this that you have to start to say, gosh, we should really pull back, and this is not what this person wants. This is not how a human being or how a body should really be treated. And the question really is, where is this line between us saving lives and just prolonging dying? And there's a great quote by Atul Gawande, who's a surgeon writer who wrote Being Mortal. So if any of you guys have read that book, it's fantastic. And he has this quote, which has stuck with me since I read it, 10 years ago at least. He says, "Death is the enemy, but the enemy has superior forces. Eventually it wins. In a war you cannot win, you don't want a general who fights to the point of total annihilation. You don't want Custer. You want Robert E. Lee, someone who knows how to fight for a territory that can be won and how to surrender when it can't. Someone who understands that the damage is greatest if all you do is battle to the bitter end." And for me, this sums up really what we're doing in the intensive care unit. Is you have to know at what point to draw back and at what point to not move forward. And it's hard to do that when you have these, sort of like black and white documents that just say, if I'm in a terminal condition, remove all aggressive care, because you have to know what you're trying to gain. And so this comes down to somebody's medical wishes, your goals of care, as we would call them in medicine. And a lot of people, this is where they get lost in the ventilators and the dialysis and all of that. But really, there's a question you can ask yourself that you should think about and you should teach your family. And this is the most important question, in my opinion, and I have named it the litmus test. So in general, any litmus test is a quick test you can apply to a situation that gives you a definitive yes or no. So in the world of advanced directives and end-of-life care, the litmus test is the question that answers, I would want to be kept alive as long as I am still healthy enough to blank. And this may seem like a simple question, but actually this will require a lot of thought, but it is the most important thing that you can think about and that you can share with the people around you, your family members and your power of attorney. So what do you wake up for in the morning? What makes you who you are? And what would you consider to be your minimum quality of life that would make your life still worth living? And for different people, this is different. So some people, it's more mental, like, if I could read a book, I would still want to be alive. If I could watch my favorite sports show, daily crossword. For other people, it's a more physical thing. Going for a walk, gardening, bathing, grooming yourself. Some people say, I would never want somebody else to wipe my bottom. Okay. If I were bedbound, just, let me die. I mean, I hear these things all the time, but you have to think about it, because for some people it is physical. For some people it's more mental. It could be social, like being able to see your family, recognizing them, talking to them, all of these things. So the litmus test. So let me give you an example, because I think always examples are helpful. So I recently had a 92-year-old woman. She came to my office and we were working on her. We were talking about some advanced directives. And I said to her, what makes you get up in the morning? What is the most important thing to you? What gives you quality of life? And she said, I take care of my 96-year-old husband. And if I were not able to, she said, basically, if he passes away, I'm ready to go too. If I'm not able to take care of him, then I wouldn't want to be alive. And for me, that is so much more valuable as a physician than no heroic measures in the event of a persistent vegetative state or something. To me, that says, if this woman came to the ICU, so say she's the patient that we've been talking about this whole time in the ICU, and her goal is to be able to take care of her elderly husband, but he's died in this case, then don't bring her back, let her go. She's ready to go. Or if we did do a lot of medical care, but we said, at the end of this, she's just going to be in a nursing home and not be able to take care of herself, then don't do those aggressive measures to try to get her to that state. So think about your litmus test and think about what's important to you. And this is different for people. I mean, I know for me, like, it would be much more about, I paint. And so it'd be like, could I, if my vision's intact, if I could still paint, I'd be very happy. For my husband, the idea of him having, somebody else have to get him dressed and bathed and showered would just be like, it would be mortifying. And of course, this evolves over time, right? Like, what's important to you when you're in your 50s and 60s is different than what's important to you in your 70s and 80s and beyond. And your abilities change. So that's why these are always evolving conversations. So normally I would ask if anyone wants to share any ideas of their litmus test, but that seems like a personal thing to do in this larger crowd. So in the case of Rachel and Michelle's mom, right, they said that she loved to garden, she loved to make dinner. If her goal is to be able to do those things and there's no way she's going to be able to do them, then I wouldn't recommend continuing all these machines and treatments to try to bring her back to, half of what she was when she even went to the hospital, which was a woman with severe dementia. So I basically gave these recommendations to Michelle and Rachel. I said, I think we should really, based on what you said about, who she was and what was important to her and where she was at this state in her health, that I think we should really focus on keeping her comfortable and allowing a peaceful death. I don't think that bringing her, restoring her to what she was is really something that sounds like any kind of quality of life for her. So I gave my recommendations and I left these two daughters to think about what they wanted. And when I returned, Rachel had been able to finally describe to Michelle really how bad things had gotten over the last couple of months. And they agreed that the aggressive ICU level care would not bring their mom back to a desired state of quality. And they agreed to go home with hospice. And she was able to die at home, about 2 days later, peacefully with her daughters there. She was comfortable during that time. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit because I think that story gives you a good sense of what can happen at the end of life. It's always black and white. So in their case, their mom had end stage dementia. But when thinking about your medical wishes and your litmus test, the nice thing about the litmus test is it can be universally applied to any situation. So is this patient here with a catastrophic stroke, a heart attack? Is this end stage cancer? Do they have a severe progressing infection like pneumonia or sepsis when the infection gets to the whole body? And really that's the power of the litmus test, is that you can apply it to any situation. So think about my 92-year-old patient who wanted to take care of her 96-year-old husband. If she had a catastrophic stroke and we said, there's no way she's gonna be able to take care of him after this, then her family might say, then let's not treat this, let's let her, die comfortably. Whereas if we said, she has pneumonia, but we think that we could do a pretty good job of bringing her back to a state that she could care for him, then we might go ahead with, aggressive treatment there. But that's what's so great about the litmus test, is it can be applied to any situation. So I make it sound simple, like, oh, we can, your litmus test, but you have to think about that. And that's a thought-provoking question. It might be even helpful to sit down and talk to your, who would be your power of attorney, so a spouse, your children, and sort of talk this out, because it might just be a series of thoughts and statements that end up making up sort of what's important to you, rather than any like one specific statement of like, do this if this.
Eleanor,
Yeah.
what I'd like to do, if you don't mind, is I'd
Yeah.
like to share what some of the questions are, and you can tell us whether you're going to be getting to that,
Sure.
or whether you would like to answer it now. So let me just mention what some of the topics of the questions are, and you tell us if you want to address them now or later.
Sure.
And you don't have to memorize them. I'll tell you.
I can't hear you.
Oh, you can't hear me? Okay. So one of the questions is, what is a durable power of attorney? How does it differ from a power of attorney that handles financial affairs? Does an advance directive have to be notarized or filed somewhere to be recognized?
I know you do. I'm trying to like log
Um,
in. I can't log in.
Let's see. Psychiatric advance directive. Can the designees in documents be foreign nationals? Talking about if the patient's already on a tube or a ventilator, can they be taken off? What's the MOLST form? What is the impact of hydration? Does it keep you alive? Does it cause pain? Maryland's law on assisted dying,
Yeah.
and some questions about hospice.
Okay.
So,
So honestly, I could write a dissertation to answer all of these questions,
Of
but let me
course.
just quickly answer as direct as I can some of the things that came up. So a financial power of attorney is completely separate from your medical power of attorney. Could be the same person because you've just chosen the same person, but that's a document you make with a state attorney. I know very little, if anything, more than what I just said about it. So that's a different person. It doesn't need to be the same as your medical power of attorney.
Okay.
For a psychiatric advance directive, so if you make an advance directive, then there's not like a separate psychiatric advance directive form. Like if the advance directive only comes into effect if you're not, in your sound mind, able to make medical decisions. So whether that's because you are so sick that you're in an ICU, or because you have a psychiatric illness that has, rendered you not able to make your own decisions, then if you have an advance directive, it would come into effect. So if you personally have a severe mental health history, like if you have a history of severe depression, if you've ever been admitted to the hospital before, or if this is a question for a spouse or children who have severe mental health, then they should especially have a advance directive, often younger, right? So if somebody has bipolar and is in their 20s, they might be more interested in having an advance directive than another, say, 20-year-old who doesn't have that, although everyone should have an advance directive. So yeah, it would be the same document. Questions about notarizing. So at the end of this, I don't think I'll have time to really go through the Maryland state, the official form, but I have in the links that we'll send out after, we'll link to it. And that form, as Ted was saying, does not need to be notarized. It doesn't need to be signed by a physician, doesn't need to be signed by a lawyer. It just needs to be witnessed. So you can make that pretty easily on your own, which is nice. You don't have to pay anyone $5,000 to do this for you. The MOLST form is a separate document from an advance directive. The MOLST form is medical orders for life-sustaining treatment. It is a one-page form in Maryland, front and back. And this document is for people who are at high risk of ending up in the hospital in the next, say, year or two. So if you have a severe illness and you expect that you might be hospitalized, or if you're older and you've just been in the hospital maybe 2 or 3 times this year, those people especially should have a MOLST form. A MOLST is different from an advance directive in that it is medical orders. So it actually specifically lists out, like, would you want to be on a ventilator? If so, for how long? Would you want dialysis? If so, for how long? And the MOLST form needs to be signed by a physician, or I believe a nurse practitioner. And so that form is always done side by side with your physician. So if you have any questions about that, you're going to be doing that with somebody. It's not like your advanced directive that you might actually just do on your own. Not when you have a lot of guidance on, but really it's for people who are at high risk of ending up in the hospital. And then the last question that I jotted down that I remembered was about Maryland's current stance on assisted dying, which is medical aided dying, physician assisted suicide. Dr. Kevorkian, as people might be more familiar. Currently, this is not legal in Maryland. I cannot prescribe something that would cause a patient to die. It is legal in DC and I believe like 11 states. So I think it's going to come back. It failed to vote in Maryland maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I think it'll come back. I think at some point it will be legal in Maryland and probably all states one day, but we're just not there yet. So honestly, cross that bridge when you get there. And medical aid and dying, just so you know, there's a lot of rules around it. You have to have a terminal illness, 6 months of life left, I believe, or less, and you have to be able to take the medication yourself. So it's not like somebody can do this for you. You are involved in those decisions at the end.
Thank you.
Are there other
Well,
questions that I missed?
Just one person who's in the class today lives in Washington, DC, wondering if the Maryland advice applies as well. Basically for an advanced directive, you just need to write it down and get 2 witnesses.
So all advanced directives are 2 parts, naming a medical power of attorney and documenting your medical wishes. Each state has a slightly different form, unfortunately. The DC advanced directive, so if you Google DC advanced directive, you can find it. And also on the ARP website, they have a list by each state, so you can look it up for any state. The official advanced directive sort of recognized by that state. I will say DC's advanced directive form is not very user-friendly. So if you are interested in using a templated form, if you live in DC, I would look at the My 5 Wishes document, which I'll send out as a link after the class, or Leah will. And that My 5 Wishes document is a legal advanced directive in, I think, like 46 states. So it's accepted most places, including DC and Maryland. So you could use it anywhere. But the Maryland advanced directive is for Maryland residents. Although if that's the only directive on file, I can't imagine that physicians wouldn't honor it. I mean, we're reasonable people, and because we know that DC, Maryland, Virginia often flow between each other, we would look at that. It's not like we would completely dismiss it because it's the wrong state.
Okay, why don't you continue, and I'll keep monitoring the chat, and we'll try to get to everything as best we can.
Sure. Yeah. So, all right. So we finished up the story of Rachel and Michelle, the litmus test, the power of attorney. These are things we've talked about so far. So I do want to talk a little bit about how people die in this country, because I think this is really interesting. So interesting, that's not the right word, but so a researcher, so this is a physician researcher who looks at a lot of different things, but did a assessment of Medicare data and looked at basically how do Medicare patients die in this country. So this was mostly for people over 65, and sort of casually. So these are the 4 ways to go. So what you'll see here is there's 4 different types of death. So top left is that's this graph up here, top left. So on the bottom here, you see time on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is function. So one mode of death is sudden death. So this is somebody who had a high level of function until something happened, and then they die. So this is your sudden cardiac arrest, your heart attack, your major stroke, your aneurysm, anyone who drops dead. This is actually really rare. So only 7% of people die this way. The next sort of mode of death is a terminal illness. So again, this is somebody who is high functioning until something happens. They're diagnosed, say, pancreatic cancer, or ALS is another one that this graph would probably pertain to. So this is somebody who something, they were doing really well, something happens, and now there's a decline to the end. And this is, people are terrified of cancer. I think that's probably, when I talk to patients, if they have any little bump on them, the first worry on their mind is I Googled it and is it cancer? And the fact is only 22% of people actually die this way. And if you've made it to 65 without dying from cancer, your likelihood of dying from cancer is actually pretty low. The bottom left graph here is organ failure. And so this one is somebody who has, say, heart failure or COPD, severe lung disease. And so what they have is maybe not such a high functioning of life, and they have an exacerbation here. So this is an admission to the hospital, say. So this is somebody who has heart failure and they go to the hospital, and then they come out and then they end up in the hospital again, maybe a couple months later. And this happens until the end. But what you'll notice is that after every single exacerbation, they come back, but they don't come back to quite where they were. It's like always a little bit of a decline, like this is not the same as here. So there's just this slow kind of decline until eventually end, where either they die from the final, from a final exacerbation of whatever their underlying illness is, or they say enough is enough, like let's not do this again. So that organ failure is about 16% of deaths, so also in the minority. So this is where I come to this bottom right, which is frailty. And this is how 47% of people die. So most of the people on this call, this is how you will pass away. And this is, at the end of life, there's just this low quality of life, not very high functioning. So these are paid, you might know a lot. I mean, this could be you, this could be a lot of your friends. It could be, if you're younger, your parents or somebody older. Where you had a lower, they have a lower quality of life, maybe they're in their 80s and they've stopped, it's all the little things. They've stopped driving, they've stopped being so social, less mobility. It's just a lower level of functioning. And then slowly there's this dwindling phase. So there's more falls, there's more confusion, the hospital, hip fractures, all that. And then eventually, something gets them in the end. I guess we would call this old age, is what people might refer to this as. So the problem with this being, not the problem, but with this now being the state of how half of the people die in this country, with ICU level care in medicine, we've gotten really good at prolonging the dying process. And so you often consciously have to decide now when to stop pursuing life lengthening treatments. So this is the pendulum that has swung. So if you look here, on the left here, so it used to be that people died at home, right? Like, you think about the old days where people would die in their 40s and 50s of pneumonia or something, and it was pretty quick. So now with the invention of ventilators and intensive care units in around the 1950s or so, pacemakers, CPR, all these things, we're now on the other side of this pendulum where we have aggressive medical care, intervention in the ICU. We can keep people alive a really long time without adding any kind of quality of life. And so now we have to consciously say, when are we not going to do more care, or when are we going to withdraw care? So withdraw care is you pull somebody off the ventilator, you pull somebody, you remove all these tubes and all these things, and then you let them pass away or recover on their own if there's any chance of that. So, the pendulum has swung. And so we have to kind of like bring this back. And the bringing it back process is something that you do with the litmus test, with talking to your family, with having an advanced directive. Because at the end of life, it's a cascade of medical decisions. It's not like black and white, you're going to die, you're not going to die, this is going to help, this is not going to help. A lot of times it's just a series of decline at the end and decisions here and there that ultimately lead to somebody's death. And so your advanced directive is kind of like your escape route from this decline, is when you say enough is enough, and your enough is enough is your litmus test. And so that is something just to think about. And as far as advanced directives go, I know there's a lot of legal documents, and like I said, there's the Maryland legal form, and there's the My 5 Wishes or the 5 Wishes form, if you want to use that, or you can make any form with a state attorney. But really, it's all about the conversation you have with your family, because no matter how much you can write in these forms, it's just never going to be the same as if you have had a conversation. So for example, my husband is, he's an organ donor. So that's an example of something you might come up in your conversation. But when you actually go to make decisions about a family member donating organs, they'll say, he's a candidate to give heart and lungs, is a candidate to give kidneys. Do you want to do corneas? Do you want to do skin? And so sometimes people feel like squeamish at the idea of certain organs, but not others, which is completely fine. I mean, these are all within your personal rights and beliefs. But when I was talking to my husband one time about organ donation, it was like, would you be an organ donor? And he stopped and he said, he said, yes, I'm an organ donor. I want them. I want to be a husk. And I sort of was like, a husk, like a husk of a corn. And I realized what he meant was like, he wants like everything gone if it ever comes to that. Like it's open season. And for me, that conversation, it just means so much more than if I read somewhere on a checkbox form that he's a donor. It's like, not only is he a donor, but he's like, take everything that could possibly be used to help somebody else. And so that's, when applied to organ donation. But when you think about advanced directives, I mean, people will say things like, just shoot me, or I would never want to live like that. And while these are, sort of like vulgar seeming statements to some people, it's helpful. It's helpful when you're in that hospital setting to say, you know what, we talked about this one time, and he said he would never want to live like that. And so these are the kinds of things that come out of having this conversation. So really, conversations about end of life wishes, it's just a conversation about values. What's important to you? What do you see as quality of life? And really what comes out in a nuanced conversation is just so much more three-dimensional than what could come out in just checking a box of, if I have a terminal condition, no heroic measures. It's just not very helpful. So let's just do a little recap. So today we talked about advanced directives, part 1, naming your medical power of attorney, part 2, defining your medical wishes. And other than litmus tests, other things you might think about. So have you seen any good deaths? What made them good? Was it a grandmother who died in her 90s in her bed and with hospice or something? Have you seen any bad deaths? What made them bad? Say somebody was really, really sick in and out of the hospital 3 times in the last 3 weeks of their life, and then they died anyway. Was the point of the other 2 admissions? So you could say to yourself, what made that a bad death? What scares you about death? People have different fears. Pain is a big one for a lot of people, dying alone. So if you share those, then your family or your power of attorney can act to mitigate that. Like, she really didn't want to be in pain. She was really afraid of dying alone, that kind of thing. Where do you prefer to die? Most people want to die at home, but most people actually die in a hospital because of situations where maybe they weren't very clear about their wishes. And so they end up being taken to the hospital in the last days of life. And then what is important to you, in the last days of your life? So is it being at home? Is it being pain-free, anxiety-free? But think about that. And then how do you picture the last 6 months of your life, the last month, the last days? And these are all things that when you're having these conversations with your potential powers of attorney, these are things to talk about. I mean, these are not single 5-minute conversations. They can be brief. They can be 15 minutes. It might be a series of conversations. You should probably update them as Ted said in the beginning, every year, every couple of years. And then now, in case you guys want to learn more, because like I said, I can't teach the entire medical justice, medical legal system in one lecture. But so if you want to learn more, so I have sent the links to these things for Leah to send out to all of you guys after the lecture. But you can look at the official Maryland Advanced Directive document, and there'll be a link for that. You can look at, for the DC residents, as I mentioned, the My 5 Wishes document is a little bit more user-friendly. The Conversation Project is at this website, theconversationproject.org. It's a whole entity. I don't even know if it's I don't know what you call it, nonprofit that is devoted to helping people have these conversations at home. There's lots of tools and conversation starters. So, if you're thinking about this, like, how do you actually talk to your 40-year-old son about this? I mean, that's where that can be a helpful resource. And then, like I said, Being Mortal is a book by Atul Gawande. It's fantastic. It's a bestseller from, I don't know, probably 10 or 15 years ago at this point. Very good. And then he has a shorter article called Letting Go, which I also have the link for going out. This is a New Yorker article. It's about 30 minutes. It's longer, but I think it really does a nice job of going through that cascade at the end of life. It's a little bit sad, so it's not like a uplifting one, but I think it's really informative and it packs in a lot. And then lastly, talk to your physician. I mean, your physicians, they know your medical conditions. They know they can guide you. I think a lot of physicians in general, like normal people, don't like to talk about death and end of life, even though we're physicians, but it can be uncomfortable. And so some of them may be more, open and honest about this than others, but they're a great resource. And if you're interested in filling out that MOLST form, that's the one I talked about, is more about end of life stuff specifically, then obviously you would need to talk to them because they would need to sign it. And then lastly, I have a website, which I think I would like to think I have some great resources there that help people. If you look under the resources tab, I have a whole article on, I can maybe just, let me just bring that up because I think it's helpful. Oh, here, sorry. This is the Maryland, I had this pulled up for you guys. This is the Maryland Advanced Directive form. I don't want to spend too much time going through it because I think this could be its own lecture on its own, but the Maryland Advanced Directive, it's, as you'll see, it's 18 pages. So that seems very intimidating to people, but I always tell my patients that the first 5, bunch of pages here are just frequently asked questions, and they're not scary questions. It's like, do I need to use a particular form? Who can be my healthcare agent? Who can witness it? These are not very complex legal questions. And then you complete it. And the first page essentially is naming your healthcare power of attorney. And then there's, there's more questions. So what I would advise you guys to do is, if you live in Maryland, look at this form and just take it home, read it, go through it. The actual meat of the form is only about 7 or 8 pages. The rest of it is kind of like the fluff. And then at the end of the form, it has a checklist. I'll show you. So of so there's the signatures and the witnesses. And at the end, there's a part about organ donation after my death, if you want to fill that out. And at the end, there's a checklist of everything that you did here. So make sure, and then, give it at the bottom, for example, give a copy of your advance directive to your healthcare agent. And then in terms of, oops, sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to, it's a bar across the top of my screen, how to make it go away. So much for feeling technologically advanced here. Anyway, so if you, I was trying to show you guys some of the resources on my website, but you can, if you just go to advanced directive, md.com, you'll see I have an article on do not resuscitate, one on MOLST forms if you want to know more, a step-by-step guide on how to make an advanced directive, and there's a lot there. So feel free to peruse that later. I think it'll probably answer a lot of the questions, and I tried to make nothing too dense. Hopefully I wrote this with the public in mind, not like it's not for a physician audience. So Janice, I think there's a bunch of questions in the chat. I'm happy to take questions. We have definitely some time left over, which was my goal, so that there's lots of time for personal questions as we go. So if anyone has any overarching themes or burning questions, I'm happy to just listen.
Thank you, Eleanor. I'm going to start at the top of the questions that have come in. I know we've addressed some of them. But I'll see if we want to hit, if we didn't hit some of them, I'll try to feed them to you. And folks at home, feel free to add questions to the chat. If you want to ask a question, that's truly a question, you could also raise your hand and I can recognize you. So give me just a moment. The first question of the day was, tell us the dates or numbers of the current Maryland advanced directives. How does that apply? You've shown us the form just now, Eleanor, right?
Yeah, so if you Google Maryland Advanced Directive PDF, just to be more specific, then you'll just get that document. So I'm not sure exactly what dates and numbers, if that, I guess every government form has like an actual number, but if you just Google it that way, you'll be able to find it.
Okay. One participant mentioned, a situation where a parent was hospitalized out of state, and a hospital refused to acknowledge her medical power of attorney and said that she had to use a hospital form. Have you seen that come up? I don't know if you can speak to New York, but have you seen that come up in this area? And how can we protect?
I haven't seen that come up. I mean, a situation, I mean, I guess I'm not sure exactly the details of that. I think it sounds unusual. So to me, I think if there's a legal advance directive that has a power of attorney, even if it's out of state, unless there's somebody who's there, like at the bedside, who would be a more obvious, power of attorney, I don't know why they wouldn't honor that. Because typically these do, even though they don't totally cross state lines, like I said, physicians are normal people. There is a legal sort of committee in a hospital if there's ever questions. But I think if there's questions about, like if you are a snowbird and you live half the year in one state and half the year in another state, you might consider having a document for each state. But if you're just traveling, usually I can't imagine you would honor an out-of-state one. Usually there aren't people like fighting over who's the power of attorney. It's usually like trying to find who that is. But I'm not sure of that situation. It sounds odd, and I feel like there's probably more details that I would need to know in the moment.
Okay. Kind of related to that, can the designees in the documents be foreign nationals living abroad? I guess can and should they?
Yeah. I think it could be anyone as long as you provide contact information and they're reachable. So they don't need to be like US citizens or anything. Lots of people have kids who live in Germany or something. So yes, it can be somebody elsewhere. You just want to make sure that they're available, right? Because if they're on a 12-hour time difference and don't answer their phones, then it makes it hard to reach them.
Right. Okay. And Eleanor, do you want to like stop sharing your screen, and that way maybe we can just it'll be easier to see your face. There you go.
Yeah.
Okay. This is a kind of a current events question. How has COVID affected the assessment of end of life conditions?
I think it just brought a lot of light to the fact that something can happen even to young people, and we don't always know what's going to happen. So it hasn't changed anything legally, but I just think it's brought more questions, more people asking questions, out into the public eye.
Here's a question about hydration. Would hydration actually keep you alive? Does it cause a lot of pain?
So it depends on the situation and what's going on with somebody. Without hydration, typically people will die sooner. With hydration, it doesn't necessarily extend your life. It just depends on the situation. And painful, probably not painful. I mean, you have an IV put in your arm, so depending on how conscious you are, that could be uncomfortable. But for example, feeding tubes that are putting like a liquid nutritionist, like a smoothie, essentially medical smoothie, into a feeding tube that puts that into your stomach is, these people aren't sort of like feeling everything because they're sedated typically, but there is probably some discomfort associated with that.
Feeding tube.
Yeah, with feeding tubes. IVs, I don't think it's uncomfortable, but it really depends on the situation, whether it's going to help.
Mhm.
You know, I
Got it.
think if doctors think that they're, so say in the case of COVID, where somebody's in a hospital, they're on a ventilator, they're really, really sick, and they're giving them the monoclonal antibodies, the treatments, and there's a chance of them, you know, turning around and getting better in the next, I don't know, week, 2 weeks. With COVID, it was longer. Sometimes it was 3 weeks. Then yes, during that time, you would need to give IV fluids, because the human body can't go 2 and 3 weeks without any kind of fluid. So if
Mhm.
there's a chance that, you know, by giving fluid, you're really just buying time while other treatments are working, then it's helpful. But if that's your only treatment, keeping them alive, then it has very little value.
Thank you. What are the different levels of hospice care?
So I'm not an expert on hospice. I won't pretend to be. But to my understanding, there are not levels of hospice care. So with hospice, a physician just needs to certify that somebody has about 6 months of life left.
Mhm.
And so as the way I think of that is, would I be surprised if this person died in the next 6 months? Because of course we don't know. And if they say, I wouldn't be surprised, yeah, this person could die in the next 6 months, then you can certify somebody can get services from hospice. And hospice, I think a lot of people think of hospice as this like angel of death service, but really they're just a supportive service that's there at the end of life when somebody has decided to not pursue aggressive, curative medical treatment. So say somebody has cancer and has done 3 rounds of chemotherapy, none of them are helping. It's clear that the cancer is going to take their life in the next couple of whatever it is, weeks, months. Then somebody can switch over to hospice, which just means they're no longer going to pursue a curative treatment. Instead, they're going to focus on quality of life and comfort. And hospice is a fantastic service. If any of you guys, I don't know if I've ever had a patient have a bad experience with hospice. I mean, really, people always say we should have gotten them in sooner. They're just there to provide services and support and phone numbers to call in case somebody has medical questions. They're there for pain control. So they really do a lot of support at the end of life, not just like symptom support.
Thank you. So you mentioned this, and Ted from AARP added into the chat that there is an assisted dying bill before the Maryland legislature. Again, it's been brought up every year for the last several years. Seems like you thought, Eleanor, eventually Maryland would get there, and DC already has one.
Yes. So medical aid in dying, again, I'm not an expert in this either. Yes, I think it's going to be like medical marijuana, that eventually every state is going to adopt it. It's just going to be people are slower to sort of come around to this semi-liberal idea. But yeah, so in DC, or actually in most states, I think you have to have 6 months of life, a terminal condition. I think 2 physicians have to certify. You might need to have a psychiatrist also certify that you're not just clinically depressed or suicidal. And then you have to be well enough to take the medication. So it's basically like an intentional overdose of a sedating medication that causes people to pass away.
Thank you. So some folks put just helpful, I wouldn't say there's a question here, helpful comments in the chat about, suggestions related to designating powers of attorney. But this one person did make a specific suggestion of perhaps the importance of having a second or a surrogate or second medical power of attorney.
Yeah. So on like the Maryland form, or actually probably almost every advanced directive form, there is a primary, and then you can have a backup, and you can designate that they are equal to each other too. You don't need to necessarily have like one primary and one secondary. You could have like 2 adult children equally, for example. But yes, having a backup is a great idea, because if you make an advanced directive when you're in your 60s or 70s, you don't really know what life has ahead of you or for your power of attorney. So if this doesn't come into effect for another 10 years or something, that person could be in worse health. Maybe they're not mobile. Maybe they're, not in a place to come help. So yeah, having a backup is definitely an important thing. And I think most forms, they ask you for a backup.
Thank you. One person asked, is it maybe not a good idea to have a legal medical power of attorney and a 5 wishes, for example? Would there be possible conflicts between those documents?
So we would go by if there is a conflict, which hopefully there wouldn't be, but if there is a conflict, you would go by the most recently dated document. So if somebody wants to update their advance directive, you would either just, I guess you would just probably just print out a new one and then update it with new dates and witnesses. So if you had two conflicting ones, you'd go by the more recent one. And if they're made on the same day, I have no idea why you would have conflicting documents if you make it. But I think that's also where having a conversation with your power of attorney is so important, because really you get them, like, not only do you give them, you know, the black and white, what do you want, but you give them like the living, breathing version of what you want.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to this question at the end. One person, and I think probably others as well, looking for more examples of the litmus test. But let me just go to some of the more black and white questions first to see if we can knock some of those off. One person asked, how important is it to have someone in the local area? This person mentions, you know, not having a spouse or children.
Yeah, so I think with technology now, you don't need somebody locally. You just need somebody who's available. We can always give people phone calls. We can always FaceTime. It is hard if they're on a really different time zone, but I'm sure they could make it work. But you just want somebody who's available and willing, right? You don't want to call somebody at 3 a.m. and then say, don't ever call me again, you know, which, you know, I mean, that can happen. People get overwhelmed. And so you do want to choose somebody who is willing. They do not need to live locally, but it could be helpful. Like if you have 2 siblings and you're torn between the one who lives in Rockville and the one who lives in Wyoming, then I would choose the local one. Or you could make them equal, just and sort of like just let the one who's more local know that they're probably gonna get the first phone call.
Forms and issues for Virginia residents.
So on the AARP website, there is a list of advanced directives by state, and you can click on like every single state and they'll bring up the official form. So if you spend a month in Colorado every summer and you want to have that form just to look at it, but yeah, the Virginia one, you can just go on to the ARP and look at any state. Great resource. We heard someone mention that when you choose to donate your body, it mostly goes to people just interested in our skin. Is that true? Who is using organs, eyes, etc.? So I'm not an expert in organ donation. My understanding is, so in order to donate certain organs, you have to actually have never had blood flow stop to those organs. So things like the heart and the lungs and kidneys typically are people who are in the ICU who do not have meaningful recovery, but have always had blood flow through those organs. And then those, you know, if their family decides to withdraw care, so like withdraw the tube. So this is like, you might hear of like, remember like Terry Schiavo or some of those cases. People like that could be organ, maybe not Terry Schiavo, I think she was actually like conscious, but anyway, so there's specific criteria for which organs can be donated. Whereas if somebody said is dead, found dead, or dies at home and then wants to be an organ donor, there are some organs that can be taken, I believe, up to 24 hours later. So that's like the skin and some, I believe, corneas. I don't know the exact details, but even if you are a, like, say you're, you know, a young person who like, so like somebody who dies and, you know, has a car accident, is in the hospital and you are an organ donor, it doesn't always mean that there's even a match that day. So for example, when I was in medical school, I went to an organ, they call it a harvest, kind of disturbing, but it was a young man who had been stabbed, who he had perfusion the whole time. His blood was flowing the whole time, but he had severe, he was brain dead. And on the day of his harvest, they were able to they had a match for his heart and his lungs. But
Mhm.
unfortunately that day there was no recipient who was a match for his kidneys, so they weren't able to give them. So I think if you're interested in being an organ donor, tell your family, mark it on your form. And unless you feel very strongly about something, the details will be handled later about what is given and when.
Mhm. Thank you. Question about section in the living will, waiver of right to revoke treatment preferences. What does that mean?
We're talking about the Maryland Advance Directive here.
I'm not sure. Maybe the person who put in the question could clarify.
Yeah, section. Wait, did they give a section number?
I think it might be I. Clarify section I.
Oh,
Let's see.
I.
Yes, Maryland Directive I. There's a section, waiver of right to revoke treatment preferences. What does that mean?
I'm not certain I'm seeing an I. What page of the Advance Directive?
Okay.
Sorry.
I'm sure the
I say
person will.
GH, and then it goes back to A.
Interesting.
G. I don't know.
I'm gonna move
Anyway,
on.
yeah,
and
move on
let
and
the
let me know.
person type in the additional information. Let's see.
Do you have any questions?
If parents insist on selecting both adult children equally as medical power of attorney, must both children voice their decisions, or can one speak for both?
I'm trying to think of the nuances. So I think, yes. So if one is not even there, then I do think that you would put out a call to the other one as the physician, just to make sure there's not a huge disagreement, just because legally you don't want to deal with that later. You want to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Mhm.
But yes, you can have one who is like, this is true of any pair of people. One is going to be more vocal than the other.
Mhm.
And if there's staunch disagreement, so if you have one child who's like, mom is like, in the case of Rachel and Michelle, one child is like, I'm ready to let her go, and the other one's like, what? We're going to let her die? Are you crazy? In that case, the doctors try to, give them some time, think about it, come around to whichever ideas are going to be, to agree on. And if people really can't agree, then sometimes we'll get the hospital ethics committee involved.
Mhm.
But that's usually not ideal, right? The ideal case is that everyone is comfortable with the decision that's made together, because
Mhm.
you don't want to have that resentment between siblings. And legally as a hospital, you don't want to be sued later for, by one who's unhappy with what happened. So there's a lot there, but I think generally, yes, you can have one who's like the primary spokesperson, but they would seek the opinion of the other.
Okay. One softball question. Did you paint the picture on the wall behind you?
I did, and I'm in this rental house because we're doing this renovation. So this is not even my favorite painting, because all my favorites are in storage. But thank you yes, I did. It's a house on Tillman Island on the Eastern Shore.
Very nice. So maybe you could, just for the next two or couple of minutes before we finish up here, go back to if you have any more examples of litmus test type questions, because I think that is maybe kind of the core of your presentation today.
Yeah.
And just in your experience, what other kinds of litmus tests have you found that patients?
Yeah. So I had one ICU attending who used to say, who she used to wear every single day. She had her lipstick on and her high heels.
Mhm.
And so for her litmus test was, if I've stopped wearing my high heels and my makeup, I'm not myself. And therefore at that point, don't do any, sort of heroic measures.
Mhm.
Or you might know some people are like these Southern women who always have their hair and makeup done. And when they're stopped, not like, that's like who they are. Of course they are always are, then at that point, like if they're either too sick or not cognitively aware enough to do that would be an indicator of decline. But it can be, this is personal. So like, it can be something that you do. It can be an activity you enjoy. It's just kind of like what makes you tick and what makes you who you are. And if you're not able to do that anymore, would your life not be worth living?
Mhm, mhm.
So like maybe taking care of your animals, being, somebody once said, if I become a burden, then, that's the end for me. Like, I don't want to be a burden on my kids. And of course that's it's a hard thing to define, but I think that's a good one too. A burden, because I think a lot of people do fear being that person who's
Mhm.
dependent on others. I think it's a complicated question, and that's why it takes some time to think about, but it's really like, if you go out every morning, you have a cup of coffee by yourself on your porch or something, like, can I do that anymore? It can be something basic.
Do any of the materials associated with the 5 wishes documentation help people with these kinds of?
Yeah, so we'll send out the link for 5 wishes. 5 wishes is a very user-friendly document.
Mhm.
So if you look at it, I think it'll help it
Mhm.
answer some of these questions.
Mhm, mhm.
It's designed, like, people will buy 50 of them for their church members and hand them out and have like 5 wishes, not parties, but like discussion. So it's supposed to be a user-friendly document.
Mhm.
Unlike the Maryland Advanced Directive is a legal document. It's like, it's a little dense.
Right. So the 5 wishes might be a little bit more qualitative along the lines of helping you decide in an affirmative way what you'd like versus sort of just what you don't want. It might just help you understand from a quality perspective.
Yeah, it's like at the end of life, what is important to me? Not being in pain, not being anxious. It's a little bit more like very user-friendly, like general for the public kind of a document.
Right. Okay, well, there were a few more questions in the chat. I hope I got to the ones that Eleanor could really give an answer to. There was some interesting back and forth between folks, which is great. It's obviously a really important topic that people wish to discuss. Eleanor, thank you so much for a terrific presentation.
You're welcome.
Ted, thank you and AARP Maryland for supporting this program. To folks at home, we're so glad you attended this online OASIS class today. You will be receiving very shortly a class evaluation that includes all the links that Dr. Tano mentioned. And we did record today's class, and we will let everyone know how you can access that if you are interested. So again, I commend everyone for thinking about this really important topic. I'm so glad that we had an expert like Dr. Tano help us out with it. She has many great resources, as does AARP. So everyone be well and enjoy life. I think that would be the best prescription for everyone. And hope to see you all again soon. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor.
My friends.